Hi everybody, Karen Fabian here, founder of Bare Bones Yoga, and I'm here to do a quick review for you of the muscles of the lateral hip. So when I say lateral hip, I mean the outer hip versus the medial, which would be more close to the middle of the body, closer to the midline. And these muscles have a couple of different functions, and once we understand what the muscles are and what their functions are, we can then start to think about how to cue to them in yoga poses and in what poses they would be contracting in to create a particular desired action in the posture. So let's kind of walk through this first, starting with the movements that the hip makes, because before we get to the muscles, it's really important that we understand what are just the movements that the hip joint makes. So the hip joint is a ball and socket, and it's going to move, therefore, in a bunch of different ways because it's got that kind of very gliding, sliding, kind of rotational structure versus something that's a little more rigid, like a hinge type joint, like elbow knee. So the hip then is going to move into flexion and extension, external rotation, internal rotation, and abduction and adduction. And so it moves in a bunch of different ways. So there's actually a lot of muscles in this area that are helping us do different movements. So again, we're going to focus on the lateral hip. So now that we know the anatomical movements, let's look at what muscles are there. So we have one muscle on the lateral hip called the gluteus medius, part of the 3-pack of glutes. However, I really like to train teachers that I work with to understand the difference rather than just that kind of lazy reference to glutes, because the more you understand about them, where they are and what their function is, you'll know that they work differently. Well, at least one works different than the other two. And that really can inform your cues and help you share more accurate information and helpful information with your students. If we're just out there teaching, talking about the core and the glutes, we're really missing an opportunity to help our students learn about the body, right, on a muscular level. So gluteus medius is on the lateral hip, and then right underneath it is a smaller part of the glutes, gluteus minimus. So those are the uppermost part of this outer hip and connects to the pelvic bone, right? And then a little bit further down from there is the TFL, or the tensor fasciae lata. And this is a muscle. When you do dissection, you'll see it as muscle. It's very clear, it's red. I mean, I don't mean it's clear, transparent. It's clear that it's a muscle, different from fascia, because it is vascular. And so you'll see it as the redness of a muscle, just like you would imagine other muscles to be. The interesting thing, though, about the TFL is that it changes both in what it is and the texture and the composition, because it changes from muscle to a fascial line called the iliotibial band. And you probably have heard of that. It's probably something that you're maybe referencing or aware of. However, maybe you didn't know, kind of literally where it was. So we've got this, what we call kinetic chain or lateral line. And when we refer to muscles in that way, a line, a chain, we're really kind of giving a shout out to the muscles that work collectively in that group to do certain things. And so here we're talking about a whole line of muscles down the lateral side of the leg. So what do you think those muscles collectively are going to help us do? So if you imagine just this whole kind of line of support, that would be on the right track, because that lateral line is good for creating support and steadiness on the outside or lateral aspect of the hips. Now, you may not think that's an important feature of a group of muscles. However, think about where they start, that uppermost part of that lateral line, glute medius, glute minimus. They are absolutely connected to the lateral aspect of the hip, i.e. pelvis. And so once we know the muscles that are there, we recognize and acknowledge where they start, and we start to think about lifting one leg, we can now really begin to appreciate that if I have weakness in those muscles, I'm going to have some hip drop. And there are definitely poses that I'm sure you're teaching where you have people stand on one leg. You know, a very common one is tree pose. So if I bring somebody into tree and I notice hip drop, it might be because of weakness in that lateral line on some level. I might not know exactly which muscle, but you know, really in the context of teaching, it doesn't really matter literally, especially because we're looking at these things collectively oftentimes as we observe people moving. So here, I can see the hip drop. So what could I potentially say to create the right action in those muscles? Well, if it's a lateral line and I see the hip drop, I can say, hey, can you hug the outer hips in? Can you hug the outer hips in? And so this may create a more level pelvis versus hip drop. And that brings us to another fundamental piece of anatomy that you need to understand, which is qualities of anatomical position. I'm not going to go into them all here, but one of the major qualities of AP is a level pelvis. And once you understand those qualities of anatomical position, you can look for them in certain poses. And the lack of those qualities in certain poses where it would make sense to see that quality is an indicator, many times, of weakness or something happening in the body on a muscular level. Something's not firing, something's firing too much, right? And those are usually the good alternates to work with, although it's not always just a binary thing. You can have something in between as well, so there's nuance to it. However, understanding anatomical position and what it is, along with anatomical actions, along with the muscles, all of that dovetails together to inform the cues that you give. And when you've got all of that information converging together and expressing itself through the vehicle of the cues that you use, I promise you, your confidence will soar, because you'll be shifting from what many teachers do, which is just repeating cues that they were taught. You'll, however, be sharing cues that come from knowledge. And when you have cues coming from knowledge, guess what that gives you? Not only confidence, but it gives you the freedom to change them up. When you're just using cues that you're repeating or cues that you hijack from somebody else's class that you took and you assume, well, she must know what she's talking about or he must know what he's talking about, then you're just a parrot. You're just repeating. There's no confidence in that, and more concerning, there's no integrity in that. You shouldn't be just repeating cues. You should only be using cues when you really understand the anatomy behind it. And a good way to test yourself is to pretend you're using that cue with a little kid. And that kid's probably going to say, why are you asking me to hug my hip in? Well, I don't know. I was just told that was a good cue for tree pose. That's a gap, or that's a position I don't want you to be in. I want you to use cues that come from the knowledge. So we're going to end this video here now that we've kind of gone through the specific content I wanted to share. If you're feeling like this is bringing up some thoughts for you about your own experience teaching, your own potential knowledge gap around this, and maybe it's kind of sparking a desire in you that, hey, I would love to transform into the kind of teacher that has the freedom to cue in this way because it's coming from a solid base of understanding anatomy. All you need to do is get on the wait list for my signature program, the Blueprint Learning Program. This is my signature program. I open enrollment several times each year. And it's not only a course that you take yourself through, it's also supporting from me in the way of regular coaching calls as well as practice sessions where you're able to learn how to translate the anatomy you're learning in the course to the cues you use. It's no good, and no teacher is going to really come out of just taking a course on their own with this kind of knowledge and application of it to teaching that I want you to have. Which is why when you're in my program, you have the course, You also have the coaching, where you're getting on the Zoom calls with me. We're going through the ins and outs of the cues, how to do it. And you're also having practice sessions with me so that you're seeing how it all comes through in the actual sequencing. So it's a full program meant to help you make this shift. So I'll include the link on this video to get on the wait list. I open enrollment several times throughout the year, so if this is at all of interest to you, don't wait. Get on that waiting list. If you have any questions, comment here or feel free to send me an email. My website is barebonesyoga.com. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you get an alert when I post my next video. Namaste.